And now we have another session ready for you, which is a discussion amongst a couple of members from our Communities of Color working group. This session will include a conversation between members of our Communities of Color working group on the intersectional impact of language and the role that it plays in the diabetes community. And firstly, I wanted to introduce you to Gatti, T1 International's US Advocacy Manager. They'll be leading today's discussion between members of our Communities of Color working group. Over to you, Lib.
Thanks so much, Faith, and thank you. Wow, I'm just feeling like totally bursting with excitement and gratitude for all the work that everyone is sharing about from the Fight for Five, the state working group, just learning about what's happening in all the different corners of diabetes advocacy. So thank you so much for being here, and thank you to all of you for the work and the advocacy that you've been doing. I'm so thrilled today to be facilitating this conversation with Lena and Danica, diving into the power and importance of language. There's a few terms that we at T1 International have heard about from our community over the years, and conversations that come up again and again in the wider diabetes community online and in person. And we're going to take some time today to dig in to a few of those words, find out a little bit more about what they mean to some members of our Communities of Color working group, and hopefully hear from all of you in the chat. So we know that language is powerful and it shapes our reality and can be very personal. So a reminder that as a community, we agree to be respectful of each other in this space and as we dive into this conversation. So before we get started, I'm going to just say a few words about our amazing panelists today, Danica and Lena. There's so much that could be said about the incredible work that these women are doing. But just to share briefly, Danica is a type 1 diabetic of 17 years, diagnosed at age 14. She's been involved with T1 International since 2017 and has served in the Communities of Color working group. She does healthcare consulting nationally and splits her time between San Diego and Tennessee. Welcome, Danica. So excited that you're here. And Lena has had type 1 diabetes since the age of 10. And she's been involved with T1 International since 2019 as a member of both the Communities of Color and state working groups. So the group you just heard about, Lena is another one of our amazing members with that group. And she lives in Washington, D.C. So thank you both so much for being here. And Lena, I'm wondering if you'll just kick us off with the first topic of our discussion.
Thank you so much, Liv, for that great introduction. Thank you all for joining today. I'm super excited for this conversation that we'll be having as a team, as well as with Liv and Danica. So as Liv mentioned, my name is Adeline, but I also go by Lena. I've been a part of T1 International since 2019, and we'll spend this session just discussing the following questions. So the first one is, how do you all feel about terms like patient, representation, and inclusion? What do these words mean to you? So this topic of conversation is to essentially explore how different aspects of identity, ethnicity, race, and gender intersect and interact with each other in complex and variety of ways. So this discussion focuses on the role that language plays within the diabetes community, particularly concerning how shape perceptions, different experiences, and inclusivity for individuals from different backgrounds. So the first term that we're going to discuss and touch on is representation. So what does that mean for someone like me or someone like you, or for even our community at whole? So to me, and I think to a lot of people, representation within the Communities of Color working group is empowerment through visibility. So that meaning that many individuals within the Communities of Color working group express that representation signifies the importance of seeing people who look like them in various aspects of the type 1 diabetes advocacy realm, and as well as healthcare. It's essentially about feeling empowered and acknowledged as a part of the community as a whole. And another aspect to representation is the breaking of different stereotypes. Representation breaks down assumptions and stereotypes, which foster a sense of belonging and challenges the misconceptions that type 1 diabetes affects only a specific demographic. So it's in a way a sense to highlight the diversity within the community. So I'll pass it back over to Liv from there.
Yeah, thank you, Lena. Thanks first for introducing us to the discussion. And yeah, just feeling acknowledged and empowered is so essential, and how we talk about ourselves and each other can really lend itself to that sense of belonging or not. So thank you for kicking that off. Danica, would also love to hear from you about the topic of representation and what thoughts come up for you with that word.
Absolutely. As you guys know, like representation and our patients or inclusions are just very important things to me. And when thinking about representation, it is one of those things like when you see someone that looks like you, that they're helping manage your health and helping make decisions on how you stay alive, it just hits different. And it also validates that, hey, my voice matters, and there's someone here advocating for someone that looks like me. From a community perspective, unfortunately, in this healthcare industry, especially in the diabetes space, there's a lack of representation. Understanding like the impacts for the BICOP community and how this contributes to the disparities that our community is facing, without having that representation, some things are left out, and sometimes our experiences and our voices might not be part of the solution. So in my mind, representation really empowers these our communities, and reassuring that our voices are heard, and they're also crucial in shaping how healthcare is making equitable solutions and equitable decisions on not just our health, but our community at whole. So when diving into representation, it goes beyond to, oh, there's one doctor out there, or there's one perspective there in our treatments, in our tech that's coming out. It's very, very important to make sure that these perspectives, our persona, is brought to the table, because otherwise it could be left out and impact us differently.
Thank you, Danica. Yeah,
Liv,
oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. I was like, I could talk about this all day.
Yes, I know. I wish we had the whole day for just this one topic. I appreciate how you said that it hits different to have someone who looks like you providing that life-saving care. I'm curious about if there's a time, this is a question for our panelists, but also everybody who's joining us, to feel free to message in the chat as well. If there is a time that you were or weren't represented, and how did that impact your sense of care or validation? Either one of you, feel free to respond, and folks, please feel free to jump into the chat as well.
I'm happy to take this one. There was a time where I wasn't represented. I was having a severe absorption issue with my insulin, and I really wasn't getting insulin. And the solution was, well, I think you're allergic to the insulin. And I had to go down this thing. It's like, hey, my skin is different. I think there's something else. I've been using it. I would have probably not made it this far if I was allergic, but there's got to be a different solution. And my skin heals different. My skin looks different. It might scar different. And in that moment, I felt pretty small, and I had to really learn how to advocate for myself from there, because I didn't feel like I was represented. I didn't feel like my voice mattered, and really my health mattered.
And thank you, Danica. I completely get that, with having to feel, we have to advocate for ourselves. Making sure our voice matters. When prior to me being diagnosed, and even being as a little kid, I noticed that I had to voice over and over. And it was, we were going on over a month to 2 months to me voicing over and over to the doctor, as well as my parents, that, you know, something wasn't right, I wasn't feeling well. And it continued to be ignored by, you know, people in the medical field who are supposed to make you feel like you are seen and assist you when you're sick. And then in addition to that, I think in recent years, especially with growing technology and the impact of social media, you know, we're having a larger, being in communities of color and being a person of color and being a Black woman, we are having impact by, you know, having our own voice. And I'm seeing a lot of us being more represented now than it was, you know, let's say 5 years ago, because prior to a couple of years ago, I wasn't able to see people. I had to actively really search for people who looked like me. So those are my thoughts, and happy to hear from anyone else in the audience as well.
Thank you, Danica, and thank you, Lena. Just to share some resonance, I really felt it, Danica, when you said, in that moment, I felt small. I felt like my health didn't matter. And again, Lena, like in your story, that you had to say over and over again that something really was wrong and feeling ignored. And this is such a critical part of our advocacy as well, to be able to say access to insulin is critical, but feeling like our lives and our health and getting competent healthcare is also just a huge part of the advocacy work that we're doing, and how important it is to have each and every identity that we hold honored and represented. So thank you both for sharing those stories. I'm thinking now about something that Tino had actually said in the Fight for Five working group, about his quote from the World Health Organization about how important it is to allow people to self-declare themselves as part of a community. And that leads us into our next question that we had about just a discussion about the word patient. And so, like, if we identify as patients, how we declare ourselves as part of the community of people with type 1 diabetes. I'm curious if each of you, and maybe we can start with you, Lena, will tell us a little bit about your relationship to the term patient.
Thank you, Liv. So to me, the term patient signifies more than just being someone who receives medical assistance and being a medical recipient. It also implies being an active participant in one's healthcare journey. And the key word here is active. It's about collaborating with your healthcare providers, sharing different advice, sharing insights, and actively making decisions together. And then my second point to the term patient is education and advocacy. To so many people, being a patient means taking on the role of an advocate or an educator within the healthcare system. But it also involves learning about one's condition, seeking the best care possible, and then, you know, overall just raising awareness to improve the overall experience for not only yourself, but for other individuals who are just like you. And I'll pass it over to Danica to share her thoughts.
Thanks, Lena. I'm right there with you. From a personal perspective, the term patient's complex for me. It is one of those things, like, it makes me feel sick or like I'm a subject, and it can really be dehumanizing. Like when you're living with a chronic illness, like, oh, you're a patient. No, I'm a person living with diabetes. But from a community perspective, I'm also seeing the term being patient isn't enough, because living as a diabetic goes beyond the medical definition. And we need more humanizing language that acknowledges like the social and the emotional dimensions of managing diabetes, because we're not just a patient, we're experts in our health. We are advocates. We wear so many hats, but in these terms, when you hear patient, it kind of has like a negative vibe to it. And we're far more than that. And we go beyond that definition in my belief.
Thank you both for sharing about that term. And thank you to everyone in the chat. We're having like a robust chat participation, which I love to see. I really resonated with much of what you both said, and particularly this piece, Danica, about how important it is to feel like the language we use humanizes us and acknowledges like the social emotional dimensions of managing diabetes. So I'm curious, our final word today is inclusion. Can you say a little bit about what the word inclusion means to you?
Inclusion is everything. It's, to me, it's how we grow. If someone isn't there, like, it's part of having a seat at the table, and it's addressing our unique needs. So other than being the majority, you have to be there. So if we're not at the table, our needs won't be met. And from a community perspective, it is crucial for our educational materials, for influencing how we understand healthcare policies, how we understand insurances, how we nurture the community of diabetics. And we must be proactive in this part of inclusion, because this inclusive environment really impacts how we live, how we survive, how we move the needle in advocacy and diabetes, because healthcare isn't necessarily going to do that alone. And without our opinions and voices and perspectives and people that look different from other people being at the table, something will be missed. Lena, I'm curious to see how you think about inclusion.
So to me, inclusion is feeling like we can show up, people from various different backgrounds and communities and cultures and ethnicities and races. We can show up, but also that what we say is actually heard. And so people are actively listening. And I think one of the words that you all have been hearing today is the word active. So actively listening to people who come from different backgrounds. So inclusion represents the creation of safe spaces where individuals from all backgrounds within the communities of color working group feels valued, respected, and heard. Also involves acknowledging and addressing the different challenges that are faced by communities. It goes beyond being present. It's about actively, again, participating and contributing to initiatives, decisions, and discussions. And it overall just emphasizes that everyone's perspectives are essential to creating the solutions for the benefit of type 1 diabetes across the globe, essentially.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I love how you said, Lena, this piece about it's active listening, and not just like active listening, but then incorporating what's said, so that people can truly be represented and have the changes that would lead to that inclusion of perspectives and identities and experiences. So thank you. I just want to say it's such an honor to hear from you both about these words. Thank you for lending your wisdom and your experiences to the discussion today about language and about how we name ourselves and our shared work. So if you're both up for it, we'll just take a couple questions from the chat. I know that one of the questions we had for the community was about how we each identify ourselves as part of the community of people living with diabetes, if the word patient resonates or doesn't resonate, and if there's other words that folks use to name themselves. So let's just take a moment. If you haven't yet, we'll take a peek at the chat and see what's happening in there. And I'm doing this live too, so I'm kind of reading the chat and facilitating. So I just want to call out some of what I'm reading is that this dialogue around chronic illness and the stigma that can come, folks feeling like wanting to reclaim an identity as a patient, folks feeling like the term patient isn't necessarily the most empowering way to talk about ourselves. So wanting to move away from stigmatizing disability. Let's see what else here. People feeling really inspired by you both sharing your stories. So thank you again. just the labyrinth of insurance and medical complications from an industry built on the white default patient system. Yes, thank you, Nathan, for that comment in the chat. I love this about identifying as an insulin-powered cyborg. Amazing. Thank you, Sarah. I'm going to start using that myself. Anything else that folks want to share? Any questions that people have that you want to share either in the chat, or Danica and Lena, any final thoughts that you want to share before we close this session?
I have just one comment on something here that I'm reading in the chat about you know, from Quinn and Laura, I believe, yes, with Laura and Quinn, where they talk about, you know, going into a job interview and not wanting to disclose the fact that, you know, you are a type 1 diabetic. And I feel like in that case, inclusion and understanding, you know, what diabetes means as a whole, also to the outside of our community, right? And so the work that we're doing is very important, because for me, being someone of, you know, someone who's a Black woman, a person of color, and then having this stigma, it kind of, I feel like there's many swords up against me before I can even give the opportunity to represent myself as who I am. So I think that was very interesting that Laura and Quinn brought that up in the chat. And I think that, you know, the work that we're doing is really important to just let people know that we are human beings first, before we are a patient, before we are any of these other names.
Yes, I'm right there with you, Lena. And something you said really sparked me when you're talking about inclusion. And one thing I really love to always emphasize is inclusivity is when you're really going from intent to impact. And I think that really just aligns with what you're talking about with action and really just moving things, because it's okay. I'm inclusive. I have the label that I'm inclusive, but are you actually doing anything with it? So I think as we think broader in the word inclusivity, we need to think about, and it's an action. It's not just a noun.
Thank you, Danica. Yes, I feel like that's a perfect place to end our discussion, that we're moving from just like thinking about it to taking action. So thank you both for sharing your experiences and your wisdom. And thank you to everyone for participating in the chat. So I'm going to hand it back to Faith to keep us moving, but just want to like give a lot of gratitude to everybody for everything you've brought to the discussion so far today, and really excited to hear the next round of speakers. So over to you, Faith.
Thank you so much, Danica and Lena, and of course, Lib as well. That was powerful and it was grounding. And I'm really glad to be involved in an organization that prioritizes inclusion, because it's usually an afterthought, which sucks, because you would think that it would be common sense that the best interventions come from the people most effective. And we shouldn't have to be campaigning just to be considered. We should definitely be at the heart of any decisions that are being made about us. And as an organization working around the world, we know firsthand the challenges of language, the nuances and importance of being aware of context and culture. It's so helpful to have these conversations and hear different perspectives. And thank you all for sharing with us too. And if you identify as someone from a racial or ethnic group that has been historically excluded and would like to get involved with our Communities of Color working group, you are welcome to fill out the interest form that Shayna will drop into the chat.